I never thought my own home would become the place where I would hear the sound of my bone breaking. My name is Clara Mitchell. I am 27 years old, and until that evening, I still believed that if I stayed quiet enough, my family would at least leave me in peace. I was wrong. My brother David Mitchell had always been quick-tempered. At 32, he carried himself with the arrogance of someone who had never been held accountable for anything. He towered over me in the kitchen that night, his eyes blazing with the same rage I had seen countless times before, only this time it did not stop at words. The argument started over something trivial. He accused me of embarrassing him in front of our father by refusing to support one of his reckless schemes. I told him I was tired of covering for him, tired of being silent, tired of living like a shadow in my own family. His face twisted into a snarl, and before I could step away, he shoved me hard against the wall. My shoulder hit first, then his hand clamped down on my arm. The next moment is seared into my memory forever. There was a sharp crack, a scream I barely recognized as my own, and a rush of white-hot pain that made the room spin. My arm hung useless at my side as I collapsed to the floor. My mother Marjorie stood frozen a few feet away. Instead of rushing to me, she clutched her pearls and whispered words I will never forget. "Do not make a scene, Clara. Your brother has a future. He cannot be dragged into scandals." I lay on the cold tile, gasping for air, staring at her in disbelief. My own mother was telling me to stay silent while I cradled a broken arm. David loomed over me with a smirk, his chest rising with the thrill of power. For a heartbeat, I thought he might strike again, but a sound from outside interrupted him. The front door opened, and Mrs. Evelyn Harper, our 60-year-old neighbor, stepped in. She had heard the shouting from her porch, and without hesitation she came in. Her eyes widened as she saw me on the floor. She rushed to my side, her voice steady even as her hands trembled.
"Clara, honey, you are hurt badly. We need to get you to a hospital right now."
She pulled out her phone and called for an ambulance while David cursed under his breath and stormed out of the room. My mother hissed at Evelyn to leave us alone, claiming this was a private family matter, but Evelyn ignored her. She knelt beside me, pressed a towel gently against the swelling on my arm, and whispered close to my ear, "You are not alone anymore." Relief washed over me in that moment, though it was tangled with humiliation and sorrow. I wanted to cry out for comfort from my mother, but all I saw was her turning her back on me to follow David down the hall. The sirens approached quickly, and within minutes paramedics were lifting me onto a stretcher. Evelyn held my hand the entire time, refusing to let go. The flashing red lights illuminated my living room walls, casting long shadows that made everything feel surreal. As they carried me out, I caught a glimpse of my father Richard standing at the top of the stairs. His face was unreadable, his arms crossed. He did not say a word. That silence cut deeper than the pain in my arm. At the hospital, the doctors confirmed what I already knew. My arm was broken in 2 places, the fracture severe enough that I would need weeks in a cast and months of physical therapy. They asked how it happened. My lips trembled. I wanted to tell them everything, but the memory of my mother's words echoed in my head. "Do not make a scene. Your brother has a future." I hesitated until Evelyn squeezed my hand firmly. "Tell them the truth, Clara." I drew in a shaky breath and whispered that my brother had done it. The doctors exchanged glances, one of them making notes, the other nodding solemnly. For the first time in my life, I had said it out loud. The shock of the act still clung to me, but beneath it, a faint ember of resolve began to glow. That night, as I lay in a hospital bed with my arm immobilized, I replayed the sound of the crack again and again. Each time, it was followed by my mother's cold dismissal. Each time, it burned deeper into me. I realized this was not just about a broken bone. It was about years of silence, years of being treated as less, years of watching David escape consequences because our parents chose to protect him at any cost. This was the breaking point not only for my arm, but for the hold they had over me. The shock of betrayal mixed with the physical agony and the strange comfort of Evelyn's steadfast presence created a storm inside me. One moment I felt crushed and abandoned, the next I felt the stirrings of defiance. I did not know then how far the road would take me, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I would not remain silent any longer. The days after the assault blurred into one another as I lay in the hospital with my arm in a cast. The doctors said I was lucky because the break could have been worse. Lucky was not how I felt. I felt humiliated, small, and betrayed. Evelyn visited every day, bringing small comforts like tea and books, her presence a reminder that at least one person believed me. My mother came once, sat stiffly at the edge of the bed, and whispered that I should not exaggerate the situation. She said families endure worse, and that my father was furious I had even spoken to the doctors. When she left, she kissed my forehead mechanically and promised she would handle everything. That chilled me more than the painkillers wearing off. A week later, I found myself standing in the stark hallway of the courthouse, the smell of polished wood and dust heavy in the air. My arm throbbed beneath the cast wrapped in a sling, but my nerves hurt more than my body. Beside me, Evelyn stood like a sentinel, her silver hair tied back neatly, her lips pressed thin with determination. She refused to let me face this alone. Across the hall, David swaggered in, wearing a suit far too expensive for him to have bought with his own money. My father Richard walked at his side, hand on his shoulder, like a proud mentor guiding a promising student. My mother trailed behind them, eyes darting away when they met mine. Their attorney, Howard Clay, a man with a reputation for spinning the dirtiest cases into misunderstandings, adjusted his tie and gave me a thin smile that felt like mockery. We entered the courtroom, a place that smelled of leather and authority. Judge Franklin Hayes presided, a man known in our city for his connections and his fondness for golf outings with powerful businessmen like my father. He barely glanced at me as I took my seat, but his eyes softened when he looked at Richard. The hearing began. The prosecutor presented the hospital report and my statement, simple facts that should have spoken loudly. My arm was broken, the injury consistent with an assault. But when Howard Clay rose, he dismissed it as a family dispute blown out of proportion. He painted David as a hard-working young man under stress, claiming I had slipped and fallen, that the injury was tragic but accidental. His voice dripped with feigned concern. Then David spoke, his tone casual, even playful. He told the judge he loved his sister, that we argued, but he would never harm me. He smiled as he spoke, as if daring me to interrupt. My stomach churned. I wanted to shout, but my throat felt locked. When it was my turn to speak, I described what happened, my voice shaking but firm. I spoke of the crack of bone, of my mother's words, of Evelyn calling the ambulance. Evelyn then testified with unwavering clarity, recounting how she found me on the floor, pale and shaking. For a moment, I felt hope flicker in my chest. But Judge Hayes leaned forward, steepling his fingers. He asked Evelyn if she actually saw David break my arm. She admitted she did not. She arrived moments after. The judge nodded slowly, like that ended the matter. Then he turned to David, his tone almost paternal. Mistakes happen in families. We must be careful not to destroy futures over misunderstandings. My heart dropped into my stomach. He turned back to me and spoke words that froze the room. David Mitchell is untouchable. My ears rang. Evelyn gasped beside me. I stared at the judge in disbelief. Untouchable. My broken arm, my pain, the witness testimony, none of it mattered. In that moment, the law itself wrapped a shield around my brother. David smirked, his lips curling into triumph, and I could feel my father's satisfaction radiating across the aisle. My mother glanced at me with something between pity and warning. I wanted to scream that this was not justice, that this was corruption plain as day, but the gavel came down and the case was dismissed. The bailiff announced the end of proceedings and people began to file out, but I remained frozen in my chair. The words echoed in my head until they became a drumbeat. Untouchable, untouchable. Evelyn placed her hand on mine, her grip strong despite her age. Clara, do not despair, she whispered fiercely. You are not alone in this. Her words pierced the fog of despair, but the humiliation clung to me like smoke. As we walked out of the courthouse, I saw reporters waiting outside, their cameras aimed at my father and David. They asked questions about business, about family, but not one about me. Richard placed a protective arm around David and told the press that his son was a role model unfairly targeted. The crowd nodded, some even clapped. I stood at the edge with Evelyn invisible, my cast heavy as chains. That night at home, I tried to confront my parents. My father cut me off coldly. "Do not bring this up again, Clara. You will ruin your brother's life and by extension this family." My mother looked at me with tear-filled eyes but said nothing. David brushed past me in the hallway and whispered in my ear, "You cannot touch me." The judge said it himself. Then he laughed, the sound slicing through me like glass. I shut myself in my room, trembling tears blurring my vision. Rage boiled under the grief. If the courts were blind and my parents deaf, then what hope was left? Yet beneath the despair, Evelyn's words returned. "You are not alone." That night, I stared at the ceiling and realized a new truth. If the system was corrupted, I would need to find another way. The thought terrified me, but it also lit a spark. For the first time, I considered that perhaps silence was no longer an option. Perhaps my voice and my will could become weapons sharper than the lies shielding David. It was a fragile hope, but it was enough to keep me breathing, enough to keep me from surrendering to despair. The gavel had fallen, but my story was not over. When I returned home from the courthouse, I carried not just the weight of my broken arm, but also the crushing silence that had defined my entire childhood. That silence had been my prison, one carefully constructed by my family to protect David and to keep me small. Lying in bed with my cast propped on pillows, I let memories surface that I had tried to bury for years. They came back in waves, each one sharper than the last. I remembered being 8 years old, clutching my favorite storybook, while David, already bigger and stronger, snatched it from me and hurled it across the room. When I cried, he shoved me to the floor and laughed. My father told me to toughen up, that boys would be boys. I remembered being 10 climbing the staircase when David sneaked up behind me and pushed just hard enough that I tumbled down half a dozen steps. My mother rushed to him first, scolding me for being clumsy. I remembered being 12 sitting with my dolls when David snatched my favorite one, cut its hair with kitchen scissors, and told me that girls like me never deserved pretty things. When I complained, my parents chuckled, saying he was only teasing. That pattern continued through my teenage years. Whenever David crossed the line, whether with insults or shoves or cruel tricks, I was told to be quiet to keep the peace, to avoid drama. My voice was drowned out by their excuses. That was the weight of silence. It seeped into me until I believed maybe they were right. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I did not deserve protection. By the time I reached college, I carried a constant fear that if I stood up for myself, the ground would collapse beneath me because no one in my family would catch me. That fear shaped my choices. I kept my head down, studied hard, avoided confrontation, and came home less and less. Yet every holiday dragged me back to the same toxic household where David's dominance ruled. Each time he smirked at me across the dinner table or interrupted my sentences with cruel jokes, I felt myself shrink. The silence did not just come from my parents, it came from me too. I had learned to stay quiet to survive. And so, when the judge declared David untouchable, it was not just the law repeating what I had heard my entire life. It was the echo of every dismissal, every excuse, every moment my pain was brushed aside. Untouchable. That word struck deep because in my family, David had always been untouchable. He was the golden son, the heir to my father's approval, the one who could do no wrong. I was the afterthought the daughter expected to endure, to bend, to cover his tracks. I thought back to a Christmas Eve years ago when David, drunk on cheap whiskey, knocked over the tree. Ornaments shattered, lights flickered, and my mother screamed. Yet instead of blaming him, they scolded me for not keeping an eye on him. I was 16, and I remember running to my room, burying my face in a pillow to muffle the sobs. That night, I promised myself I would escape one day. But promises made in whispers rarely stand against walls built by years of fear. Even as an adult, that silence still lived in me. After the hearing, I tried to speak up again to tell my father how wrong it was, how broken the system seemed, but his glare silenced me. His voice was low, measured, dangerous. "Enough, Clara. Do not destroy your family for the sake of your pride." My mother sat beside him, eyes red, but lips sealed. She would not contradict him. I felt like that little girl again, standing at the bottom of the staircase with bruised knees blamed for being clumsy. The silence pressed on my chest until I could hardly breathe. But this time something was different. I was not alone. Evelyn had stood beside me in court, her voice unwavering. She had told me I was not alone. Her words replayed in my mind as I lay in the dark. For the first time, I wondered if silence could be broken, if the weight pressing down on me could be lifted. I thought of every woman I had seen on the news who spoke out against injustice, every survivor who chose to tell her story despite threats and shame. Could I be one of them? The thought frightened me because I knew what it would mean. It would mean defying my father's power, my mother's loyalty, my brother's threats. It would mean stepping out of the role I had been forced to play. It would mean consequences. Yet the memory of that crack, the sound of my bone breaking, made me realize consequences had already come. My silence had never protected me. It had only protected them. That realization stirred something fierce inside me. I pressed my good hand against the cast, feeling the ache radiate through my arm, and whispered to myself in the dark, "No more silence." The weight of years pressed heavy, but within it, a seed of defiance began to grow. The silence had shaped me, but it would not define me. The next chapter of my life would not be written in whispers, but in words spoken clearly and actions taken boldly. I did not know exactly how yet, but I knew one thing with certainty. I would break the silence before it broke me. The morning after my vow to never again surrender to silence, I woke with a heaviness in my body but a sharper determination in my mind. My arm still ached under its cast, but the pain felt almost secondary to the storm of thoughts rushing through me. I knew I could not fight this battle alone. If my family and the judge were determined to shield David, then I needed people who still believed in truth and accountability. That realization brought me back to Detective Laura Chin. She was a woman I had met briefly during the initial hospital interviews, with her dark hair pulled into a no-nonsense bun and eyes that seemed to pierce through excuses. She had asked me careful questions about what happened. Even then, I had sensed her frustration when the case was quietly swept aside. I found her number on the card she had left and dialed it with trembling fingers. When she answered, her voice was calm but wary. "Clara, I was hoping you would call." We met at a quiet coffee shop tucked on a corner street away from the courthouse and its politics. Laura leaned across the table, lowering her voice. "I want to be honest with you. I tried to push your case forward, but it was blocked from above. Judge Hayes made it clear there would be no pursuit without physical evidence directly showing David in the act. They claim the testimony and medical report are not enough." She clenched her jaw, clearly disgusted. I asked her what that meant for me. She sighed. "It means if you want justice, you need evidence that cannot be denied. Something undeniable." Her words echoed in my mind. Something undeniable. I felt the weight of that phrase. Laura looked at me with steady determination. "If the law is blind, you must give it sight. Find the proof, and I will do everything I can to see it through." I left that meeting both anxious and invigorated. I walked home with Evelyn at my side, telling her what Laura had said. Evelyn nodded firmly. "Then it is time we stop relying only on what they allow and start gathering what they cannot ignore." Her eyes held a spark I had not seen before. She led me to her porch and pointed to the small camera installed near her front door. "Clara, do you remember the night it happened? This camera recorded everything that faced your house. It should have caught David storming out after hurting you." My heart leapt with hope. She helped me access the footage, scrolling back to the night of the assault. There it was, the faint outline of David rushing from the front door, his face twisted in anger, my mother following him in panic. It was not the actual assault, but it was damning context. My pulse quickened as I realized this might be the undeniable proof Laura had spoken of. Yet, hope can be fragile. Days later, when Evelyn tried to save the footage to a secure drive, the file was gone. The camera system had been hacked, its memory wiped clean. Evelyn stared at the blank screen, fury in her eyes. This was no accident. I knew instantly who had done it. My father Richard had resources connections and more than enough money to pay someone to erase evidence. I felt the air leave my lungs as despair threatened to choke me. Again, it seemed the power of my family could erase the truth, leaving me voiceless. I sat at Evelyn's kitchen table, head in my hands, trembling with frustration. For a long moment, I thought the fight was already over before it even began. But Evelyn placed a firm hand on my shoulder. Clara, listen to me. They may have money, but they underestimate persistence. They think erasing one file erases the truth. It does not. You are still here. You are still willing to speak. That is more powerful than they realize. Her words steadied me, though doubt gnawed at my mind. That night, lying awake, I stared at the ceiling, replaying everything. The silence of my family, the smirk on David's face, the gavel of Judge Hayes. The weight of hopelessness pressed heavy, but beneath it a new thought formed. If my father could erase one camera, then I needed to find a way to gather evidence he could not touch. It would require cunning secrecy and courage I was not sure I possessed. Yet the ember of defiance from the night before grew stronger. For the first time, I began to imagine myself not just as a victim, but as someone who could fight back. Still, the fear lingered. Every creak of the house sounded like David's footsteps. Every phone call from my parents filled me with dread. My mother left voicemails begging me to stop stirring trouble, warning me that I was tearing the family apart. But each time I listened to her words, I heard only the same message I had been given my whole life. Be silent. Protect David. Sacrifice yourself. And each time it hardened my resolve further. One evening, Evelyn joined me on her porch, the summer air heavy with the scent of blooming jasmine. She handed me a cup of tea and looked me straight in the eye. Clara, if the front door closes, you find a window. If the system fails, you find another way. Do not give up now. I sipped the tea warmth spreading through me and whispered a promise to her and to myself. I will not give up. I will find the undeniable proof. For the first time since the night of the assault, my tears were not only of despair. They carried a thread of determination fragile but real. Somewhere deep inside, I knew the battle ahead would test me, but I also knew I was no longer the quiet girl who hid behind silence. I had allies now. Evelyn's fierce loyalty and Detective Laura's guidance were shadows at my back ready to step into the light. And in that knowledge, I found the strength to keep moving forward, even as the enemy erased traces of the truth. The night after discovering that the camera footage had been erased, I sat alone in my room staring at the pale wall while the cast on my arm seemed heavier than ever. The despair had nearly swallowed me, but Evelyn's words refused to leave my mind. If the front door closes, you find a window. I realized I had spent most of my life waiting for someone else to protect me or to do what was right. My parents had never done it. The court had turned its back. If I wanted justice, I would have to gather it myself. The thought scared me because I was not trained like a detective and I had no background in law, but I knew one thing no one else did. I knew how my family operated. I knew their patterns, their voices, their arrogance. That could become my weapon. My quiet rebellion began with a small recorder I bought online, one that could slip easily into a pocket or under a cushion. With my good hand, I practiced turning it on and off until I could do it without looking. I studied where my parents and David tended to gather to discuss things they did not want outsiders to hear. The living room with its thick drapes and the heavy oak coffee table had always been the stage for hushed family meetings. That would be my battlefield. My heart pounded as I prepared to act. One Saturday evening, I heard their voices drifting down the hall. My father speaking low and sharp, my mother fretting, David laughing bitterly. I slid the recorder beneath the couch cushion earlier that day, praying it would capture everything. I pretended to walk past the doorway casually, my sling cradling my arm, my stomach a knot of nerves. I could hear fragments, Richard telling David not to worry that he had already taken care of the footage, my mother warning that neighbors were talking, David scoffing and bragging that he could do whatever he wanted because no one would touch him. My knees nearly gave out as I realized this was exactly the confession I needed. My pulse roared in my ears. If they discovered what I had done, they would destroy the device and maybe worse, but I forced myself to walk calmly back to my room. Hours later, when the house was finally quiet, I retrieved the recorder. My hands shook as I played it back under the blanket. The voices were muffled, but clear enough. I heard my father say he had hired someone to wipe the footage. I heard David sneer that if I ever spoke again, he would make sure I regretted it more than a broken arm. My mother whispered that he should not say such things, but then quickly hushed when Richard barked at her. Tears spilled down my cheeks as I listened. It was terrifying to hear their cruelty so plainly. But it was also the first time I held proof in my hands. Proof that they were guilty. Proof that their power was not invincible. My fear was immense. Every creak of the floorboards outside my room made me think they had discovered my secret. But as I lay there trembling, another feeling rose higher: pride. For once, I had not stayed silent. I had acted. That pride carried me through the next day as I planned my next steps. I could not let them know what I had. I had to play the obedient daughter, the weak sister, the silent victim. That disguise would protect me while I gathered more. So I smiled faintly at dinner, nodding when my father lectured me about loyalty. Inside, I burned with a fire they could not see. Each day, I added to my collection. I slipped the recorder into my purse during car rides, tucked it under chairs, left it running in the kitchen while I washed dishes slowly with one hand. Bit by bit, I captured the way my father schemed to silence critics, the way my mother begged him to keep things quiet, the way David bragged about being untouchable. The fear never left me. Every time I hid the device, I felt sweat on my palms, and my stomach twist in dread that they would find it. One evening, as I sat on the couch, David leaned close, his breath hot with menace. He hissed into my ear that if I ever embarrassed him again, he would not stop at one broken bone. My entire body froze with terror, yet deep inside I whispered to myself, "The recorder is on. His words are mine now." That was the essence of my quiet rebellion. I did not raise my voice. I did not fight him physically, but I gathered his arrogance and turned it into evidence. The silence that once suffocated me became my cover, and under that cover I was building a case brick by brick. At night, I lay awake, exhausted, yet determined. I imagined the day I could place these recordings before someone who would listen, someone who could not ignore. The fear was still sharp, but alongside it was a growing strength I had never felt before. For years, I had been the sister who endured, the daughter who stayed quiet. Now I was something else entirely. I was the witness to their own corruption, and for the first time in my life, I felt that maybe, just maybe, their fortress of lies could begin to crack. The first time I carried the recorder out of the house, I felt as if every eye in the world was on me. My heart pounded as I slipped it into my bag and walked to meet Attorney Marcus Bell at his modest office on the edge of downtown. The building was old brick, the kind of place most people passed without a second glance, but inside was a man known for standing up to bullies with resources far greater than his own. Marcus was in his 40s, broad-shouldered, his tie slightly crooked, his eyes sharp with both weariness and conviction. He listened silently as I explained everything from the night David broke my arm to the judge declaring him untouchable to the erased footage. Then I set the recorder on his desk and pressed play. The room filled with the voices of my family. My father's deep command ordering the footage destroyed my brother's sneer as he promised to hurt me again. If I opened my mouth, my mother's faint protests silenced by Richard's bark. Marcus leaned forward, his jaw tightening. When the recording ended, the room was quiet except for the hum of an old fan. "Clara," he said slowly, "this is exactly the kind of evidence that can turn the tide. It is not just hearsay. It is their own words." His expression hardened. "But you must understand what this means. They will fight back. Your father has influence, money connections. He will try to crush you. Are you ready for that?" My throat was dry, but my answer came clear. "I am ready." For the first time, I believed it. Marcus nodded. "Then we start building a case." He explained the steps carefully. We needed to secure the recordings in multiple places, transcribe them, and prepare to present them to a judge who could not be swayed like Hayes. He would begin quietly reaching out to colleagues, gauging who could be trusted. As I left his office, I felt both relief and dread. Relief that someone finally believed me. Dread because I knew my father would sense something shifting. That dread proved true. Within days, Richard grew restless. I overheard phone calls in which he snapped at business partners. There were rumors swirling in the local paper about questionable contracts at his company. For the first time, I saw a crack in his armor. He slammed his briefcase on the dining room table one evening, shouting that investors were pulling out because of gossip. My mother rushed to soothe him while David smirked and poured himself a drink, seemingly unconcerned. But I saw the tension in his shoulders, the flicker of doubt in his eyes. Evelyn whispered to me later that neighbors had begun asking questions about the ambulance that night and about why David was not charged. The community was not blind, and whispers had power. My quiet rebellion had already begun to ripple outward. Still, the cost at home was heavy. My mother grew colder, accusing me of betraying my own blood. She would pass me in the hallway without meeting my eyes, muttering that I was tearing the family apart. Richard confronted me directly one night, his voice low and dangerous. "Clara, if you continue this foolishness, you will regret it. Your brother is the future of this family. Stop this crusade before you destroy us all." I met his gaze with a steadiness that surprised even me. "You destroyed us the moment you chose to protect him instead of me." He stared at me for a long moment, then turned away. But I saw it, the flicker of unease, the crack in the fortress. Meanwhile, Marcus called me regularly, his updates cautious but encouraging. He had found allies, lawyers, and advocates who despised the corruption of men like my father. He warned me that it would be a long fight, but every day we held on was a victory. I clung to that thought. Fear still wrapped around me at night, but each time David's threats echoed in my mind, I reminded myself that his words were no longer secrets. They were evidence. One evening, David stumbled home drunk and belligerent. He cornered me in the hallway, his breath sharp with liquor.
"You think you are brave now, Clara. You think anyone will listen to you."
He leaned close, his voice dripping with menace. "I could break more than your arm if I wanted." My body shook with terror, but I forced myself to remember the device hidden in my pocket recording every word. My fear did not vanish, but beneath it was a strange sense of power. He was handing me the rope to pull him down, and he did not even know it. Days later, Marcus confirmed that the new recording was priceless. He told me that combined with the first one, it painted a damning picture of abuse threats and obstruction. Richard's name carried weight, but so did the truth when it was undeniable. Around that time, my father's company faced its first real blow. A contract with a major supplier was abruptly canceled, citing concerns about reputation. I overheard my father on the phone raging that gossip about his family was hurting business. His fortress was crumbling, and he knew it. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. Yet at home, he clung harder to control, insisting that I stop talking to outsiders. My mother begged me again to let things go. She cried that we were being ruined. I listened quietly, but inside I felt stronger. I was no longer the silent daughter. I was the one gathering the truth that would finally hold them accountable. The fortress they had built for David was cracking not because of wealth or power, but because of their own arrogance. They had underestimated me, underestimated Evelyn, underestimated the simple persistence of someone who refused to be silent. And as I stood in my room that night listening once more to the recordings that carried their voices, I knew that the cracks would only grow wider until the entire structure of lies came crashing down. The decision to step from the shadows into the light was not made lightly. I had lived most of my life under the heavy curtain of silence, and exposing the truth meant tearing that curtain down for the entire community to see. Marcus warned me that once we went public, there would be no turning back. He sat across from me at his office, stacks of papers and transcripts between us, his expression stern but encouraging. "Clara," he said, "when this story leaves this room, it will gather a life of its own. Your father will use every connection he has to discredit you. Your brother will lash out. Your mother will call you a traitor. Are you ready?" I swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing against my chest, but then I thought of the recordings, the pain in my arm, the memory of the judge declaring David untouchable. I nodded. "I am ready." Marcus leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Then we move forward." He contacted Detective Laura Chin, who had been waiting for an opening. Together they planned a small but decisive press conference. Not a grand spectacle, just enough to invite local reporters who had begun sniffing around the edges of the Mitchell family's secrets. Evelyn agreed to stand beside me. When she told me her decision, her voice carried no hesitation. "I have lived in this neighborhood for 30 years, Clara. I have seen your parents cover for David too many times. It is time the world sees what I saw that night." Her loyalty brought tears to my eyes. In the days leading up to the event, my nerves twisted relentlessly. My father paced through the house, furious at the rumors spreading in town. He barked orders on the phone, threatened lawsuits, and tried to keep David out of sight. David, however, seemed almost amused, sneering at me whenever we crossed paths. "You are not strong enough to ruin me, Clara. No one will ever believe you." His arrogance only fueled my resolve. The morning of the press conference, I dressed carefully, choosing a simple blouse that allowed the cast on my arm to be visible. I wanted people to see the evidence, not just in recordings, but in my body. Evelyn wore her Sunday best, a navy dress, and pearls her chin high. Marcus stood with a folder in his hands, Detective Laura at his side, her badge clipped firmly to her belt. The small group of reporters assembled cameras ready, their curiosity sharpened by weeks of whispers. My stomach churned as Marcus stepped forward to introduce us. He spoke with measured clarity, outlining the case without embellishment. Then he pressed play on the recording. The courtyard filled with the unmistakable voice of my father ordering evidence destroyed, my brother boasting that he could hurt me again. My mother's timid objections silenced. The reporters leaned forward, pens scratching furiously, cameras flashing. My chest tightened as I listened, shame and vindication colliding inside me. When the recording ended, Evelyn stepped forward. Her voice steady and calm recounted what she had seen that night, how she found me on the floor with my arm twisted unnaturally, how she called the ambulance while my mother urged silence. She looked at the reporters directly and said, "I am here because the truth matters more than protecting those who think they are untouchable." My turn came. My legs trembled, but I forced myself to stand tall. I spoke about the years of silence, about the night my brother broke my arm, about the courtroom where justice was denied. My voice shook at first, but grew stronger with each word. I told them how silence had been demanded of me my entire life, and how I refused to live in that silence anymore. By the time I finished, a hush had fallen over the courtyard. Then the questions began. Reporters pressed forward, demanding to know how Judge Hayes had dismissed the case, asking if my father had interfered, wanting to know if more evidence existed. Marcus assured them more was being prepared. Detective Laura added firmly, "No one is above the law, not even those who believe themselves untouchable." The story broke that evening. Headlines blared across the local news. Teacher's daughter attacked by brother judge declared him untouchable. Evidence suggests cover-up. The image of me standing with my cast Evelyn at my side played on repeat across television screens. I should have felt triumphant, but what I felt was a mixture of fear and release. Fear of the storm that would follow. Release that the truth was finally outside the walls of my house. My phone buzzed with messages from strangers, some offering support, some warning me to be careful. My father's reaction was immediate. He stormed into my room that night, face red with fury. "Do you realize what you have done? You have destroyed our name, our business, our family." His voice cracked with rage, but beneath it I sensed panic. I looked at him steadily, my fear replaced with a strange calm. "No, Father. You destroyed it when you chose lies over truth." His eyes narrowed, but he said nothing more, slamming the door behind him. My mother sobbed in the hallway, wailing that I had ruined everything, but even her cries could not drown the sound of the news anchor declaring that the district attorney's office was reviewing the case. For the first time in my life, the silence in my house did not scare me. It felt like the pause before a reckoning. David avoided me for days, his smirk gone, his swagger dimmed. When we did cross paths, his eyes held fury, but also something new, doubt. That night, Evelyn came to sit with me. She held my hand and whispered, "You did it, Clara." The silence is broken. Tears spilled down my face, not of despair this time, but of relief. For once, the truth had a voice louder than the lies. The risk was enormous. I knew retaliation would come, that my father would pull every string he had left, but the world had seen the cracks in their fortress. And now that the truth was out, it could not be shoved back into the shadows. The fallout from the press conference arrived faster than I expected. Within 24 hours, the story spread beyond our city. Regional stations picked it up, then national outlets began to sniff at the edges, fascinated by a tale of privileged corruption and a family determined to silence its own daughter. My father Richard had always prided himself on control. He built his business empire on carefully managed appearances, charming investors at gala dinners, cutting deals behind closed doors, and silencing critics with favors or threats. But as the headlines multiplied, his polished mask began to crack. At the breakfast table, he barked into his phone, his voice raw. "I said pull the deal, do it now. I will not let them think I am weak." He slammed the phone down so hard the silverware rattled. My mother Marjorie hovered near him, wringing her hands, her eyes darting toward me as though I were a ghost haunting her house. David sat slouched with his coffee, trying to appear indifferent, but I noticed his hand trembling slightly when he lifted the cup. For the first time in years, I sensed uncertainty in him. That uncertainty grew as news trucks began parking on our street. Reporters knocked at doors asking neighbors about the Mitchell family. Evelyn gave them measured but firm statements describing what she had seen and refusing to be intimidated. Other neighbors began to speak too, recalling incidents when they heard shouting or saw me hiding bruises or watched David strut around with arrogant impunity. My father's fortress was no longer impregnable. Whispers had turned into voices and voices into a chorus. The first real blow came 3 days later when a major supplier announced it was terminating its contract with my father's company. The statement cited concerns about ethical practices. My father exploded, throwing a glass against the wall in his office. I watched from the doorway unseen as shards scattered across the carpet. His shoulders sagged for a moment, just long enough for me to see fear creep in before he straightened and barked for his assistant to prepare damage control. But damage control no longer obeyed him. Shareholders demanded explanations. Investigators began asking questions about financial irregularities. The same influence he had wielded for decades was slipping through his fingers. Judge Franklin Hayes, the man who once declared David untouchable, suddenly found himself under scrutiny. Journalists dug into his record, unearthing a troubling pattern of dismissing cases connected to wealthy families. When a photo surfaced of him golfing with my father at a private club, the outrage boiled over. Within a week, he announced his resignation, citing health reasons. The irony was bitterly sweet. The man who silenced me with the word untouchable was now untouchable no longer. My father's anger grew colder, harder. He avoided me except to throw sharp commands. "Do not speak to reporters. Do not step outside without permission. You are finished, Clara." But his commands sounded desperate rather than commanding. My mother clung to him, whispering that everything could still be fixed if only I would apologize. I refused. The crack in their control widened when David lost his temper publicly. One evening, he stumbled out of a bar, drunk, started a fight in the parking lot, and sideswiped another car while leaving. The incident landed in the news the next morning. Police could not sweep it aside this time because cameras captured everything. The image of David staggering with glassy eyes circulated widely, contradicting every claim of his innocence. My father tried to spin it, claiming stress and harassment, but the story had already taken shape. The violent brother, once protected by a powerful judge, was spiraling. At night, I heard my parents arguing, their voices no longer hushed. My father raged about business collapsing. My mother cried about being shunned by her social circle. David shouted that none of it mattered and that he was still in charge. Their fortress was no longer a fortress. It was a crumbling castle with cracks too wide to patch. I should have felt only vindication, yet a part of me still ached. Watching the people who raised me unravel was not satisfying. It was painful. But I reminded myself that pain was the consequence of their choices, not mine. Evelyn visited often, bringing calm into the chaos. She told me the community was watching closely. People were tired of seeing power abused. They wanted justice, not excuses. Detective Laura confirmed that the district attorney's office had officially reopened the case. That night, I stood in front of the mirror in my room, looking at the cast on my arm, at the faint bruises still fading on my skin. I whispered to my reflection, "It is happening. They are losing control." For the first time, I believed the scales could truly tip. The collapse of their control was not sudden, it was steady, inevitable, each lie unraveling, each arrogant act exposed. And as I listened to the sound of my father shouting behind his closed office door, I realized the truth. The man who once ruled my world with silence and fear was now terrified of a daughter who refused to stay quiet. The courthouse was crowded the morning the trial began. The air carried a tension that seemed to seep into my bones as I walked through the front doors with my cast finally removed, but my arms still aching from months of recovery. I wore a plain navy dress, nothing dramatic, but I made sure to stand tall to let the reporters see that I was no longer the silent girl who had been ignored. Cameras flashed and microphones thrust forward as questions rained down. How did it feel to finally face your brother? Did you believe justice would be done this time? I said nothing, just kept walking with Evelyn by my side, her presence like a pillar of strength. Marcus Bell, my attorney, carried our evidence in a heavy leather briefcase, his expression calm and focused. Detective Laura Chin nodded to me from the hallway, giving me the assurance that law enforcement was ready to support us. When we entered the courtroom, the contrast between us and the defense was stark. On one side sat David with his expensive suit, his hair slicked back, but the confidence he once flaunted seemed to waver. His eyes darted around, jaw clenched tight. Beside him sat Howard Clay, still polished but visibly strained. My parents were behind them. Richard looked older, his face lined with worry and anger, while Marjorie clutched a handkerchief as though her tears could wash away the years of silence. The judge presiding was not Hayes. That chapter had ended when he was forced to resign. Instead, Judge Amelia Grant, a woman known for her no-nonsense approach and refusal to bow to pressure, entered the room with firm steps. Her presence carried authority that even Richard Mitchell could not ignore. The trial began with opening statements. Marcus stood first, his voice steady but sharp. He told the jury that this was not just about a broken arm, but about a system that had been twisted to protect the powerful. He spoke of silence, of intimidation, of evidence destroyed, and of a young woman who refused to remain voiceless. His words painted a picture of my family's fortress of lies, and he promised the jury that the truth would tear it down. Then Howard rose his tone smooth, trying to sway the jury with talk of family disagreements blown out of proportion, of a loving brother misunderstood. But I could see sweat on his brow, a hint of nerves that betrayed his confidence. The first witnesses were called. Doctors testified about my injuries, describing the severity of the break, how it could not have been caused by a simple fall. They showed x-rays charts and medical notes. I listened, my stomach churning, as the images of my fractured bones flashed on a screen. Then Evelyn took the stand. Her voice was steady, her posture straight. She described walking into my house that night, seeing me on the floor, hearing my cries of pain, and watching my mother whisper to stay quiet. She looked directly at the jury and said, "I will never forget the fear in Clara's eyes." It was the fear of someone who knew she had no protection inside her own home. The jury leaned forward, listening intently. Howard tried to shake her on cross-examination, suggesting her age made her memory unreliable, but Evelyn shot back with a glare that silenced the courtroom. "I may be 60, but I know what I saw. I know what I heard. You cannot erase that." The next moment was mine. My palms sweated as I took the stand, but I forced myself to breathe steadily. Marcus guided me gently through my testimony. I recounted the night of the assault, the sound of the crack, the words my mother spoke, the fear that paralyzed me. I spoke of the courtroom where Hayes had declared David untouchable, of the despair that nearly drowned me, and of the quiet rebellion that led me to gather evidence. My voice wavered when I described the years of silence, but when Marcus played the recording of David threatening me, my father ordering the footage destroyed, and my mother's helpless protests, the room fell into stunned silence. Every word filled the chamber, undeniable, irrefutable. I looked at the jury and saw shock, anger, and disbelief etched across their faces. Howard scrambled during cross-examination, trying to suggest the recordings were manipulated, but forensic experts confirmed their authenticity. The walls of defense began to crumble. Detective Laura testified next, explaining how the case had been initially blocked and how evidence had been hidden. She laid out the timeline of corruption and interference. Then Marcus called financial experts who connected Richard's money to hush payments and questionable contracts. Piece by piece, the puzzle formed, showing a family willing to sacrifice truth to protect their son. When David was called to the stand, his arrogance flickered back. He smirked, denied everything, and insisted he loved me as a sister. But when Marcus pressed him with questions about the recordings, his composure cracked. He stumbled over his words, contradicted himself, and finally erupted in anger. "You think you are better than me, Clara. You think you can destroy me." His voice rose, echoing across the chamber. The jury watched wide-eyed as he revealed the temper that had ruled our family for decades. Judge Grant's gavel came down sharply. "Control yourself, Mr. Mitchell." But the damage was done. The jury had seen his mask slip. Closing arguments carried the weight of everything we had fought for. Marcus reminded the jury that no one is untouchable, that justice cannot exist if we allow power and influence to override truth. He told them that this was their chance to restore faith in the system. Howard tried to salvage dignity, but his words rang hollow against the mountain of evidence. The jury deliberated for hours that felt like years. I sat with Evelyn holding my hand, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Finally, the bailiff announced a verdict had been reached. The courtroom filled again, tension suffocating. The foreman stood, paper trembling in his hands. "We, the jury, find the defendant David Mitchell guilty of aggravated assault, guilty of threats and intimidation, guilty of obstruction." My breath caught tears streaming silently down my face. The judge turned to David, her voice cold and unwavering. "Mr. Mitchell, you believed yourself untouchable. You are not. I hereby sentence you to 12 years in state prison." The gavel struck final and resounding. David's face twisted from rage to shock as deputies moved to restrain him. My father shouted from the back, claiming injustice, but Judge Grant silenced him with a glare. My mother sobbed openly, clutching his arm, but no one listened. As David was led away in handcuffs, I met his eyes. For the first time, I felt no fear. He glared at me, but I sat taller, stronger, unbroken. The courtroom erupted with whispers, reporters rushing to file their stories. Evelyn squeezed my hand and whispered, "You did it, Clara." You broke the silence. My knees nearly gave out from the flood of emotions, but Marcus steadied me. "You were brave," he said simply. As we walked out into the blinding sunlight, I was overwhelmed by the roar of voices. Cameras flashing, questions shouted. But beneath it all, I felt something I had not felt in years. Freedom. The reckoning had come. The fortress of lies had fallen. And for the first time, justice belonged to me. The days following the verdict felt like stepping into a new world, one where the ground beneath me was finally steady instead of trembling with fear. Yet the aftermath of the trial was not a simple story of celebration. It was messy, painful, and revealing. Richard Mitchell, my father, who once carried himself like a king, now walked with shoulders bent under the weight of investigations. The verdict against David triggered scrutiny into my father's finances. Reporters dug deeper, unearthing questionable deals, hidden accounts, and tax discrepancies. Soon, federal agents came knocking. His business partners began withdrawing, contracts dissolved, and within months, the empire he had built started to collapse. I watched him retreat into his office phone calls, growing more frantic, his once commanding voice reduced to hollow threats. There was a day I passed his office door and heard him muttering to himself, no audience left to impress. It struck me then that power built on intimidation has no foundation. My mother, Marjorie, fared no better. She clung desperately to the illusion of our old life, attending luncheons only to be met with whispers and cold stares. The women who once praised her withdrew embarrassed to be associated with a family whose secrets were now front-page news. She began to avoid leaving the house, pulling curtains closed, as though darkness could shield her from the truth. When she spoke to me, her words were brittle. "You destroyed us, Clara." I would look into her tear-streaked face and think of all the times she told me to stay silent, to sacrifice myself for David. No mother I wanted to say you destroyed yourself when you chose to protect lies instead of your daughter. I rarely spoke those words aloud, but the truth lingered between us. David, locked away behind bars, no longer loomed over me in the hallway, but the memory of his threats haunted me at night. Yet in reports from the prison, I read he was angry, defiant at first, but slowly the arrogance dulled. He faced consequences for the first time in his life, and though it did not erase the pain he caused me, it reminded me that even the untouchable can fall. Amid the wreckage, there were glimmers of light. Evelyn Harper received a community award for courage, and I stood beside her during the ceremony, my heart swelling with gratitude. She had been the first to tell me I was not alone, the first to believe me without hesitation. As the applause filled the small town hall, she squeezed my hand and whispered, "See, Clara, the truth has power." Detective Laura Chin was promoted, recognized for her integrity and persistence in pursuing cases others abandoned. She told me quietly one afternoon that my bravery had inspired more women to come forward with their stories. Hearing that I felt a sense of purpose rising, the realization that my suffering had become more than personal, it had become a spark for change. Yet recovery was not simple. My arm healed physically, but every time I looked at the thin scar along my skin, I remembered the night of the crack, the sound that had defined my breaking point. I carried it with me like a badge, a reminder of both my pain and my strength. Some nights I still woke sweating, hearing David's voice threatening me in the dark, but when fear clawed at me, I repeated Evelyn's words, "You are not alone." Slowly, I began to reclaim pieces of my life. I returned to work at the local library, the familiar smell of books grounding me. Patrons looked at me differently now, some with pity, others with admiration. A few older women whispered their own stories, hinting at decades of silence in their families. I listened, offered what comfort I could, and promised them that silence was not the only option. The community that once watched from the sidelines now rallied. At a town meeting, I spoke about my journey. My voice trembled but grew stronger as I described the cost of silence and the necessity of courage. When I finished, the room stood in applause, and for the first time I felt seen not as a victim but as a survivor. My father's name became synonymous with downfall. Headlines chronicled the collapse of his company, the investigations that stripped him of wealth and standing. He tried to fight hiring new lawyers, giving brief statements to the press, but his empire was gone. Neighbors who once envied us now shook their heads with pity or disdain. Marjorie withdrew further, her calls to me fewer, her words bitter. She could not accept that her sacrifice of me had failed to save the family she worshipped. I carried sorrow for her, but I no longer carried guilt. The aftermath was not only about their downfall, it was about my rise. I found myself invited to speak at community centers, asked to share my experience with young women navigating family conflict. Standing before them, I felt both vulnerable and powerful. I told them the truth, that silence is heavy, that fear is real, but that courage grows the moment you refuse to be quiet. Some cried, others nodded with fierce recognition. In their faces, I saw pieces of myself, and in my story, they saw possibility. Through it all, Evelyn remained by my side, a steady force. One evening, we sat on her porch, watching the sun set in hues of gold and crimson. She sipped her tea and said, "Clara, do you realize you have become what they feared most? Not a victim, but a voice." I looked at her tears, stinging my eyes, and whispered, "I just wanted to be heard." She smiled gently. "And you were?" The world listened. In the quiet aftermath of chaos, I began to rebuild myself piece by piece. The cracks in my family had widened into collapse, but from the rubble I found something unexpected. Freedom. I was no longer trapped by the weight of silence, no longer defined by fear. The consequences had been severe, but they were clear. My father's empire gone, my mother's illusions shattered, my brother behind bars, and me, scarred but standing. The months after the trial unfolded like the slow blooming of a flower long pressed under stone. At first, everything felt fragile, uncertain, as if at any moment the weight of the past might crush me again. But step by step, I began to build a new life from the pieces left behind. My arm was healing, though the scar remained a thin, pale line etched across my skin. Instead of hiding it, I chose to see it as a reminder of survival. Each time my fingers brushed it, I remembered the night of the crack the courtroom where David was sentenced to the press conference where I finally spoke. The scar was not shame. It was proof that silence had been broken. I found work at a women's support center downtown, a place where survivors of domestic violence gathered to share stories, find resources, and rebuild. On my first day, the director, a kind woman named Angela, welcomed me warmly. "We need people who understand from the inside," she said, and I felt my throat tighten with emotion. Sitting in that space, hearing voices trembling with fear and courage, I realized that my story was not mine alone. It belonged to countless others who had been told to stay quiet. One afternoon, a young girl came in with her mother, her eyes wide with fear. She noticed my scar and whispered shyly, "Did someone hurt you too?" I knelt down, looked into her eyes, and answered softly, "Yes, but I survived and you will too." She smiled faintly, gripping her mother's hand, and in that moment I felt a deep sense of purpose. The pain I endured was not wasted if it could light a path for someone else. Outside of the center, I slowly reclaimed parts of myself I had long abandoned. I took evening walks without looking over my shoulder. I laughed with Evelyn on her porch, sipping tea as we watched children ride bicycles in the street. I joined a yoga class where I learned to breathe deeply to release the tension that had lived in my body for years. Each small act of normalcy felt like a victory. My relationship with my parents remained strained. Richard faced ongoing investigations and rarely contacted me. When he did, it was curt defensive, as if I were still an enemy rather than his daughter. Marjorie called occasionally, her voice filled with sorrow, but I sensed she mourned the loss of reputation more than the pain she had caused me. I listened politely, but I no longer let her guilt shape me. I had built boundaries, something I never imagined I could do. David wrote from prison once a short letter filled with bitterness and blame. I read it once, then set it aside, refusing to let his words hold power over me again. Healing did not mean forgetting, but it meant choosing what I allowed to remain. The community continued to rally around me. At a town hall, I was invited to speak about resilience. Standing before a crowd of older men and women, many of them the same generation as Evelyn, I shared my journey. I spoke of the cost of silence, the danger of unchecked power, and the strength that comes from speaking truth. The room was quiet as I finished, then applause swelled not the shallow clapping of obligation, but the deep recognition of shared humanity. Some came to me afterward, tears in their eyes, confessing their own long-buried stories. In their vulnerability, I felt connection. In their courage, I felt hope. The transformation within me was not sudden. Some nights I still woke sweating, haunted by echoes of David's threats. But instead of curling into fear, I reached for the anchor of my present life. I would make tea, sit by the window, and watch the stars, reminding myself that the worst had already passed, and I had survived. Slowly, the nightmares lost their grip. Evelyn remained my steadfast companion. One evening we walked through the park, autumn leaves crunching beneath our feet. She looked at me with a smile. "Clara, you carry yourself differently now. You stand taller. Do you feel it?" I nodded, tears brimming. For the first time in my life, I said I feel free. She squeezed my arm gently. Freedom is worth every scar. In those moments, I realized healing was not about erasing pain, but about transforming it. The girl who once hid in silence was gone. In her place stood a woman who had faced fear-exposed lies and rebuilt herself from the ruins. Rebirth did not come in a single flash of triumph, but in every step I took toward a life defined by my voice, not my silence. As winter gave way to spring, I found myself walking through the familiar streets of my neighborhood with a sense of peace I had not felt in years. The air was crisp, the sky wide and clear, and beside me, Evelyn moved with the steady grace of someone who had carried me through storms. My scar ached faintly in the chill, a quiet reminder of the night that changed everything, but instead of recoiling, I touched it gently, acknowledging it as part of me. Life had shifted in ways I could not have predicted. David remained behind bars, serving his sentence. His name, now synonymous with arrogance, punished. My father, Richard, lived in the shadow of investigations his company dismantled piece by piece. The empire he worshipped crumbling into dust. My mother, Marjorie, retreated from society, her whispers of shame no longer powerful enough to bind me. Their downfall was not my triumph alone, but the natural consequence of choices they had made for decades. I did not rejoice in their ruin, but I refused to carry guilt for it. Justice had finally balanced the scales. At the Women's Center where I worked, I continued to meet people who carried their own scars. Each story was unique, yet all carried a common thread: someone had tried to silence them. And each time I looked into their eyes, I reminded them what Evelyn reminded me. Silence may feel heavy, but it can be broken. I spoke at community events, schools, and gatherings. My words were simple. Power does not come from hiding the truth. Real power is the courage to speak it. Sometimes my voice trembled, sometimes I paused to breathe through emotion, but every time I spoke, I felt the weight of the past lifting further. At one event, a student asked me, "Do you think people like your brother can ever change?" I thought of David in prison, stripped of privilege, forced to confront a reality he had never faced. I answered honestly, "Change is possible, but only if they accept responsibility. Without accountability, there is no growth." The student nodded thoughtfully, and I realized that was the lesson I had needed all along. Not vengeance, not revenge, but accountability. That was justice. Evelyn often joined me at these events. She became a symbol in her own right, the neighbor who refused to look away. Together, we showed that allies matter, that one voice can spark another until silence crumbles. One afternoon, as we walked through the park, Evelyn asked Clara, "Do you ever regret speaking out?" I thought of the pain, the backlash, the loss of family ties. Then, I thought of the young girl who whispered to me at the center of the women who found courage in my story of the freedom I now carried. "No," I said softly. "I regret every year I stayed silent, but never the moment I chose to speak." She smiled, her eyes glistening, and squeezed my hand. "That is the final lesson, Clara. Silence protects the wrong people. Words protect the right ones." Her wisdom stayed with me. As seasons turned, I found joy in small things, sharing meals with friends, laughing at simple jokes, feeling the warmth of sunlight on my face without dread shadowing me. The scars remained, but they no longer defined me. They were chapters, not the whole story. In time, I even received a letter from someone unexpected. It was short, typed, unsigned, except for initials I recognized as David's. It said simply, "I see now. Actions have consequences." I do not know if remorse truly lives in his heart, but for the first time, I sensed the possibility that even he could learn. Whether he did or not was no longer my burden. My burden was gone. My story was mine. And that was enough. To anyone listening, to anyone reading these words, I say this power is not found in wealth, in connections, or in fear. Power is found in truth, in the courage to act when silence demands obedience. I was once a woman broken by silence, told I was nothing, told I should protect those who harmed me. But I chose another path. I chose to speak, and in speaking, I discovered freedom. If you have ever witnessed injustice, if you have ever been told to stay quiet for the sake of someone else's comfort, remember this: silence is not peace. Silence is a cage. Break it. Speak. Stand. Your voice matters more than you know. As Evelyn and I strolled home that evening, the sun casting golden light across the street, I touched my scar one last time and whispered to myself, "This is not just a mark of pain. It is a mark of survival. I am not the girl who was silenced. I am the woman who spoke. And now, I ask you who listen to me, have you ever seen injustice hidden behind silence? Have you felt the weight of secrets crushing what is right? Share your story in the comments. Let your voice join mine. And if you believe in the power of truth, subscribe so together we can continue to shine light into dark places. Because justice does not begin in courtrooms or headlines. Justice begins the moment one voice dares to rise.